In the midst of our study of the synthesis of yoga, it is useful once in a while to step back and put into context what we are reading in the larger picture of the integral yoga. Sri Aurobindo describes in this rich, detailed, practical, and experiential text the whole framework of yoga, the total body of knowledge of yoga, in all its specializations, aspects, methods, techniques, processes, and behind them all the principles. And with each, he gives you a rich perspective of the various lines in which these practices can take us, the various specializations or narrow objectives that one could choose to focus on, and puts them all in context in the larger movement of an integral evolution and transformation. In the broad picture of the whole development of the yoga, there are three practical foundations: the yoga of works, the yoga of knowledge, and the yoga of love, which are all three applicable in practice in the midst of all activities of life. All three are as if specialized starting points depending on the temperament of our nature, through which one may turn our consciousness towards the divine while in the midst of life. In the yoga of works, it is through the consecration of action and through action that one turns to the divine. In the yoga of knowledge, it is by the discipline of self-awareness and renunciation in consciousness that one begins to enter in relation with the divine. In the yoga of love, it is by turning the heart and giving ourselves in love to the divine that we turn to the divine. These three specialized starting points then merge into a single triple path which takes up our whole nature and turns it Godward. But still, this is not the real sadhana of the integral yoga. It is at best a base of preparation. Upon this is a common foundation of equality, of purification first, which is the foundation on which the sixfold or six aspects of the practice of the integral yoga proper, the transformative practice of the sadhana, is then developed. We are at this point in our study reading Sri Aurobindo's description of the yoga of knowledge. But throughout this description, he not only takes up the conventional path of the yoga of knowledge, which has a very narrow objective and aim of withdrawal from the world, but he widens it by redefining the nature of knowledge, the nature of concentration, the nature of renunciation, to bring a broader perspective in tune with the larger goals of the integral yoga. And at each point in dealing with these things, he treats them at their most essential level as they are applicable equally in the yoga of works and the yoga of love. And so although our focus is on one of the three legs of the stool, it is at the same time encompassing the full picture, including the later development of the proper transformative practice of the yoga. And so with this backdrop in mind, we look at the current chapter that we are studying, where Sri Aurobindo, having described the complementary aspects of practice of concentration and renunciation, turns the discussion now to the form in which the one has to practically take this forward. Practically, he says, this path is a re-ascent up the great ladder of being, down which the soul has descended into the material existence. And this means recovery of the self, our true existence. In the portion we have seen, Sri Aurobindo has described how the central error because of which we do not know ourselves truly is the false identification that we have, first with our body, then with our life, and then with our mind. And these three false identifications are then taken up in great detail for what they, in the various ways in which they entangle us and the various aspects of each of these experiences of entanglement. All this, he says, is a mixture of truth and falsehood. Mind as a universal principle, life as a universal principle, and even matter as a universal principle all exist. Within each of them, nature has formed individualizations in mind, in life, and in matter, which are all real also. But the identification of the soul with these things is a false identification. And then he goes on, which the passage we read last time, to explain in what way this identification is false. Sri Aurobindo is always extremely precise, but also comprehensive. The knowledge that he has to formulate not only should stand the scrutiny of rationality, but much more so, it must represent the deeper truth of things as accurately as possible. And in the deepest truth of things, nothing is false. Nothing is wrong. Everything is true in its proper place, in its proper context, in a certain limited perspective. And therefore, you will rarely find Sri Aurobindo making an absolutist statement that says, this is not true at all, or this is impossible. Because such a thing does not exist in the universe. Everything is true within a certain perspective and limited context. Everything is possible, again, within its limited context. Everything is right. Equally, everything can be wrong when in the different context, anything can become false when placed completely out of its true context. And so Sri Aurobindo takes great pains to explain, while he says the identification of the soul with these things is a false identification, there is still a truth in saying, I am mind. There is still a truth in saying, I am life, or I am body, or I am universal mind, or universal life, or universal matter. There is a truth in that statement. And so he needs to take pains to show us in what way that statement is true and where it is limited, beyond which it becomes false. And that is the portion which we had read last time, briefly, rapidly. But we just reread that before we move to the next portion of our discussion. He says, individual mind, life, and body are forms of ourselves, insofar as we are centers of the multiplicity of the One. Universal mind, life, and body are also forms of ourself, because we are that one in our being. And this is the crux of the truth of these identifications, that in the one consciousness, there is a special focus on these various gradations or levels of consciousness, each of which represents a special principle. And the soul can dwell and does dwell on each of these levels of consciousness in their universality. And to that extent, as they are forms of ourself, because we are one with that in our being, we can say, yes, we are universal mind, we are universal life, we are universal body. Equally, when the self sets up these special focal points of individuality in order to manifest multiplicity out of oneness, we are the centers of that multiplicity. And so to that extent, we can say we are mind, we are life, we are matter or body, as centers of the multiplicity. But to say that is all, or that is the deepest truth, would be the error. So where is the correction? And he immediately takes us back to the full picture in which these partial truths are seen in context. He says, but the self is more than the universal or individual mind, life, and body. And when we limit ourselves by identification with these things, we found our knowledge on a falsehood. In the act of limiting to say we are only this or only that, then our knowledge is basing itself on a falsehood, and everything thereafter becomes falsified. We may take an analogy, and we used these images earlier also. Last time we used the image of the microscope. And as we put our eye on the microscope and dwell on the narrow experience of a few bacteria on a plate of glass, at that moment, that is our whole focus, our whole world, our whole reality. And if at that point we say, this is all that I am, that would be the error. To be able to step back from this and know that there is a microscope to which I am currently attached and identified therefore with its view of the world and its limited experience of the world, that I can step back from that identification and see not only this microscope but also that telescope and all the apparatus of my play space or laboratory, that is the world. And to be able to step back even from that and know that this laboratory is itself a specialized form and expression of my total freedom, which is beyond all these. And within this, I can throw any number of millions of possibilities of instruments and play with each of them and identify with each of them or with none of them. That would be the true status of my freedom. And to know this while I engage with the microscope or the telescope would be the participation in the divine play from the status of the freedom. So when we limit ourselves by identification with these things, we found our knowledge on a falsehood. And as a result, we falsify our determining view and our practical experience, not only of our self-being, but of our cosmic existence and of our individual activities. There are two things which are falsified. Our determining view, that is the view in which we look upon everything, by which we determine the value of all things, and therefore our relationships and our actions. If in looking through the microscope, that is the only reality, and I am one with the microscope, then of course I will behave in certain ways. But if I see the bigger picture of all the other instruments and the possibilities of a larger expression, of course I will deal with the microscope in different ways. And so on. I've mentioned before a rather unusual incident, a rare but not impossible, where a young man playing a computer game was so immersed in the game that he did not eat or drink or sleep, they say, for 3 days, or what he ate was just eaten mechanically. And at the end of those 3 days, he died of a heart attack while playing the computer game. He was so immersed in the virtual reality with which he had identified, he forgot that he was a body which had specific needs, including food and sleep. He forgot that he was a mind which was free and could play not only this game but all other games, including the game of life, which is bigger and more complex, of which this video game is a very small part. And he forgot that behind it all, there was a purpose, a larger perspective, meaning to life itself than just this. The perspective with which we look upon things, the determining perspective, is what sets all the values. Since he was in the game, and in the game that is all that he knew, this is all the reality, survival in that game, overcoming and winning it, was all that mattered. Therefore, that set the priority of all that he did. To the extent that when young children get so immersed in these, and they are immersive games, they're designed to be immersive, they get so immersed in these virtual reality games that when they disengage from the computer in order to eat or to sleep or to converse with others, the objectives and the reality of the rules of that world remain in the backdrop. You are engaging with human beings, but somewhere at the back of your mind, you're still living those truths and those principles and values. In that world, let us say it is a fantasy world of wizardry, you have gained certain powers, you have certain miraculous incantations by which you can change things, leap across distances, and do all kinds of things. And here in the material world, you feel out of place. This seems unreal. I want to apply my powers, which I've been spending 8 hours doing in that game, and I'm unable to do it. And I want to get back to my real world, which is in that video game. These are experiences which are very real for the children in that state of immersion. But something similar happens for those who have not played those immersive games. Something similar happens when you read a novel. And especially a novel in which a whole reality is built up. And if you've been reading in a sustained way for several days, you find while still in your conventional material world, the reality of that world of the novel is at the backdrop and even prioritizes certain values of your life. And it is only when the novel ends and its impact fades that you come back to your conventional sense of values. It is very easy for the mind to shift, reorient itself, to look at things differently, and to immerse itself in a very different paradigm or perspective. But that determines, if it is a determining view, it determines everything, not only who we are, our role in the world, and our individual activities. But equally, not only the determining view is falsified, but our practical experience is also falsified. In our practical experience, Sri Aurobindo describes how there are 7 layers of ignorance, 7 veils which limit our true experience of reality. And there's a limitation in time, there's a limitation in space, there's a limitation of individuality, and so on. All of which lead to a practical ignorance in life. These are the veils which bind us, cloud us, and make us forget our true relationship with things. And then we experience the world in frustration, of incapacity, lack of clarity, confusion, and so on. So both our determining view and our practical experience of our self-being, cosmic existence, and individual activities. All of these are falsified. So what is the truth when we look from the perspective of the highest station? And this is the description he takes up now, followed by how to re-establish ourselves in that. What practical method can we use to disengage from this false identification with mind, life, and body? And he will describe the two approaches, the negative method and the positive method. So he says, the self is an eternal, utter being and pure existence, of which all these things are becomings. Mind, universal mind, life, matter, individualizations in mind, life, and matter. All of these are becomings of the self which is eternal, utter. There is only that, nothing else. Being and pure existence. From this knowledge, we have to proceed. This knowledge we have to realize and make it the foundation of the inner and the outer life of the individual. So you see in here, the first focus is on the recovery of the self as this pure existence and eternal and utter being, of which everything else are becomings, expressions, manifestations. And based on this, we have to re-establish the inner and the outer life. The yoga of knowledge, starting from this primary truth, has conceived a negative and positive method of discipline by which we shall get rid of these false identifications and recoil back from them into true self-knowledge. So now he gives us these two methods as it is conventionally practiced in the yoga of knowledge. Later, he will show you the limitation of the realization that these practices will take you to. Although they are important, they are true up to a degree, they have limitations. And he brings back the context of the integral yoga then and shows you how you must further go into a further deeper practice which will complete the fullness of the realization. So we still study these because this is something which we have to practice in any case. We just keep in mind that this is not all, that there's something more subsequently. The negative method is to say always, I am not the body, so as to contradict and root out the false idea, I am the body. To concentrate on this knowledge, and by renunciation of the attachment of the soul to the physical, get rid of the body sense. Now stated in one single sentence, it is a practice which sometimes yogis have spent decades in fulfilling. It need not take decades. It need not take even years. By a strong power of concentration and by an inner act of renunciation, one can even attain to this within a few hours or a few minutes, if that concentration and renunciation is strong enough, sharp enough. In practice, though, we may build upon it gradually over days, weeks, months, while working simultaneously on other aspects of the correction. This is focusing on the body, similarly on the life, and similarly on the mind. Or we may take this one, take it as far as it goes, and then concentrate on the practice of the separation from life, and then on separation from the mind. And at that point, when we turn to this same practice of separating from the body, we might find it is now much easier and swiftly completed. To a practical degree, of course. There are always parts in us which will remain to some extent entangled until much later. So we say, I am not the body, to contradict and root out the false idea. The whole formulation of the sentence is very precise and covers all the finer nuances of the practice. So you say this, but the objective of saying this is to contradict first the idea that I am the body. So suddenly within you, there are two parts which form. There is one part which is identified with the body that feels, I am the body, I am in pain, I am suffering. And there's another part which says, I am not the body. And that part seems as if to separate. And you find two parts in you. One part with the old habit of identification, another part beginning to separate. But at that point, he says, after contradiction, you root out the false idea. You now shift yourself entirely to the I am not body station, and as if expunge the part where the identification takes place, or expunge the identification itself in that part. And then, how do you do this? To concentrate on this knowledge, and by renunciation of the attachment of the soul to the physical, get rid of the body sense. And so the method is focusing on this knowledge that I am not the body until you are identified with it and you feel yourself not body anymore. And at the same time, there is the renunciation, the separation, detachment of the soul to the physical. Now, soul here is I, the person who am attached to the body. I separate myself. Now, you see here in the practice, these two complementary facets which we have been studying in the last two chapters: concentration and renunciation. On the one hand, you concentrate on the station of consciousness, I am not the body. On the other hand, you renounce the attachment to the physical and get rid of the body sense. You have at that point, and this is not difficult to attain in a basic degree, one can even do it within a few minutes of concentration. You find yourself standing back. Oh yes, I have a body, but I am not body. And a part of you is now separating. But we persist in this. We try to extend this separation into our life, into our values, into our relationships, into our experiences. As I eat food, even as I enjoy the food, I'm aware that I am not the body. There's a part of the body which is enjoying the food, and there's a part of me that enjoys, which is not body also. Or I may take a more ascetic way and say, whatever the food enjoyment is, I do not identify with it. I am an enjoyer of simply being aware. Food is one of many experiences. One can play with many variations, and you will see how some of these more ascetic practices are useful. And this is the reason why they are practiced in those ascetic paths. As a result, get rid of the body sense. And when that is completed, I still have a body. The body may still experience pain, pleasure, comfort, discomfort, but I am not identified with those. And you can say very truthfully, my body is paining. You could say, my leg is paining, my head is paining. You don't say, I am in pain. You say, I am in pain when you have identified with the body. When you stand back, the stomach is paining, the stomach is hungry. In the stomach, I feel hunger. But I'm okay. This is first step. Next, we see again, I am not the life. And by concentration on this knowledge and renunciation of attachment to the vital movements and desires, get rid of the life sense. Again, the vocabulary is very precise. There's a concentration on the knowledge that I am not life. There's a renunciation of the things by which I am attached to life, attachment to vital movements and desires. Vital movements here will include any movement of pulls and pushes of energies. Most prominently, these take the form of desires, but they can also come in the form of reactions, of revulsions, likes, dislikes, and so on. All movements which pull and push energetically, I stand back. I am in stillness behind. These are not me. Get rid of the life sense. We say finally, I am not the mind, the motion, the sense, the thought. And by concentration on this knowledge and renunciation of the mental activities, get rid of the mind sense. Now, here you see in the practice itself, he formulates it differently. Earlier it was just I am not body, then it was I am not life. Here he has formulated it as I am not the mind, the motion, the sense, the thought. And there's a reason, because this last separation is often the most difficult. When you separate from body and from life, who is separating? And often what you feel yourself as is the mind person. I am the mental being who am not body, who am not life. And then when you have to say I'm not mind, who's saying this? It's the mind saying I'm not mind, right? So there is a bit of a struggle. Unless I have a station already behind or above mind, I cannot truthfully say I am not mind. Fortunately, within the mind itself is a capacity to disengage from several things within mind. And so one begins with those things. And so that's why he has a formulation which goes, I am not the mind. And then there are 3 steps we disengage: the motion, the sense, the thought. So the first thing you disengage from is the movement of the mind. Your mind is wandering. Your mind is drifting from this to that to the other, jumping constantly by associations, by impulses of sensations and the thoughts. So the first thing you disengage from is this continuous movement, activity, chaos, agitation, and instability of the mind's movement. You disengage from the movement, I am not mind, and the movement is separated from. At that point, when the movement is discarded, you still have sense and thought. Because through mind you are perceiving things. It could be through bodily sense, or it could be through mind's sense. My mind sees, my mind perceives, my mind relates to. And so mind's tendency to relate to sense is then withdrawn. I disengage from that. And at that point, you are pure awareness of thought. You can still think. I am now free from the mind's agitation. I am now free from the mind's attachment to its sense. I am thinking awareness. And then the last step, I disengage from the thought. I am pure awareness. But it may still be mental, and that's fine. But I am in a mental stillness of awareness, without thought, without sense, without movement, watching the thought, sense, and movement if they continue, or watching them lapse if they lapse. And either of these may happen. When we first disengage, often the things may continue. Or if we remain in stillness long enough, those things subside and become only like a background noise, not active, forceful agitations, sensations, or thoughts. Whatever, I don't care, I am not those things. I am awareness. And thus, there is a renunciation of the mental activities, concentration on this knowledge that I am not the mind. And with this, we get rid of the mind sense. When this is done, it is a great step, because everything else becomes easier after that. To get to this point again is not difficult. All it needs is a bit of a sustained practice, a sustained concentration. And often one can begin to glimpse this within a short time. If you're spending a little time every day, then within a few days you can begin already to have a sense of this. If you're sitting in one continuous concentration, if your power of concentration is developed, one can get to this often within a few minutes or an hour or two. If you're doing it in short sessions with brief pauses, you will find very quickly you're able to stand back from your mind activities and thoughts, and you are just this mind awareness, still, silent. Thoughts may continue, but my awareness is silent. This is the important point. And at this point, something very interesting begins to happen. When we thus create a gulf between ourselves and the things with which we identified ourselves, their veils progressively fall away from us, and the self begins to be visible to our experience. And this happens automatically. I may have no idea of what you mean by self. I have only these philosophical thoughts, concepts. Experientially, I may have nothing. But from the point you are able to thus stand back, the veils progressively fall away from us, and the self begins to be visible to our experience. Automatically, there is this sense of something felt like a presence as a backdrop, or something which is immanent, which is everywhere, or something which is felt as massive, presiding over everything. You cannot quite place, you cannot quite give it form because it is not in the domain of form, but you sense it. And it becomes to you more and more vivid, more and more concrete. And there's a transition which he says progressively. So progressively, as these veils fall away, the identification with these parts, body, life, mind, begin to fade away. Equally with that, progressively the self begins to be visible to our experience. Now, he uses the word visible because, in fact, one has this sense that as if it's something everywhere, because it's everywhere, you have a sense of sensing it or seeing it, as if the air is filled with something, dense presence. And it becomes real enough that it is easy for you to turn your attention to that. And by that time already, because these veils have become less entangled, the veils are falling away, your attachment, your identification is less entangled, it's easy to turn attention to this sense of the presence and the self. Now, all of us, at some time or other, even without having gone through this 3-step process of disengaging identification, all of us have had experiences of this presence. And this is the gift of the divine, that in order to prepare us, experiences are briefly given to create familiarity. And sometimes it happens spontaneously. You might be doing nothing in particular. You might just be daydreaming, and it is as if something massive, dense presence just settles. And you wonder what happened, what is this? Or you are in nature and you suddenly feel this immense peace and wideness and release. Or you're sitting near the Samadhi or at the Matri Mandir, or sitting in meditation at home, and suddenly something comes upon you and you feel the presence concretely. Those are the moments we have to catch and remain immersed in the sense of the presence, to familiarize ourselves with that, to let the experience imprint itself as deeply and in all parts of us as possible, so that by familiarity we are able to recover it at will later. If we don't do that, then it comes, it goes, and then we say, oh, yesterday it was so beautiful, where is that gone? And last year it happened on my birthday, but somehow it has not happened afterwards. Well, we didn't take the trouble to take full advantage of it. But the point is, it is already there. In this process of the veils falling away by separation from the false identification, we automatically feel it dawning on us. And if nothing else, if we simply sit in silent concentration, invoke Mother's help, ask her to establish her presence and let us feel it concretely, she will give you that as easily as she has always given in the past, even when she was in the physical body. This is the reason why you will find in the actual practice of the sadhakas in the early days of the ashram, Although you will find Sri Aurobindo speaking of these things, and where necessary highlighting such a practice with the disciples, for the most part, they did not have to say too much. When you sat with Sri Aurobindo or the mother, the presence came. It was so concrete, and you were pulled into it. And that was it. The experience was given. Having read nothing, you still had the experience, and you knew it for what it was. If you had read this, you would also understand the value of it. In most cases, though, in those days, the sadhakas who had come already had a prior preparation. Many of them had been through some kind of sadhana and practice, and therefore a certain familiarity with these ideas and concepts was already there, even with the practices. But the specific steps of these 3 degrees of separation were not absolutely necessary to be done in that way, because, well, the experience was given to you, and if you immersed yourself in it, the thing was done for you almost automatically. So this principle is still valid today. You can still sit in your home, at the samadhi, in the matrimandir, in nature, in front of the ocean, before the sky, and feel the presence of the self, and without needing explicitly to identify, disengage from the body, life and mind, you will find yourself immersed in that, and the separation almost automatically taking place in degrees. But one has to cultivate this, extend this subsequently into activities of life. And then very quickly, a status is reached when a part of you remains immersed in the sense of the self, if nothing else in the idea of the self. And all these things of the body, life, mind become as if they're seen to be almost mechanical. Oh yes, my body is eating, my mind is thinking, my personality is talking, but I'm enjoying the sense of the self. And a bifurcation is there. I'm describing these various approaches so that we understand the context of the practice is not limited to following explicitly these sequential steps. It can be done more directly, which is in fact the nature of the practice highlighted in the Yoga of Transformation later on. There, the primary effort of the 6, after the purification, the primary effort of the 6 aspects, facets of the yoga practice, the first is equality. In the very act of developing equality, one is founding oneself in the self. If we can just take a brief detour to read from that portion, you will see how he describes this. The Elements of Perfection is the name of the chapter, and there he discusses the first necessity is some fundamental poise of the soul, both in its essential and its natural being, regarding and meeting the things, impacts and workings of nature. This poise we shall arrive at by growing into a perfect equality, samatha. The self, spirit or Brahman is one in all, and therefore one to all. It is, as is said in the Gita, which has developed fully this idea of equality and indicated its experience on at least one side of equality, the equal Brahman, Samam Brahma. The Gita even goes so far in one passage as to identify equality and yoga. Samatvam yoga uchyate. Equality is the highest yoga. That is to say, equality is the sign of unity with the Brahman, of becoming Brahman, of growing into an undisturbed spiritual poise of being in the infinite. Its importance can hardly be exaggerated, for it is the sign of our having passed beyond the egoistic determination of our nature, of our having conquered our enslaved response to the dualities, of our having transcended the shifting turmoil of the gunas, of our having entered into the calm and peace of liberation. Equality is a term of consciousness which brings into the whole of our being and nature the eternal tranquility of the infinite. Moreover, it is the condition of a securely and perfectly divine action. The security and largeness of the cosmic action of the infinite is based upon and never breaks down or forfeits its eternal tranquility. That too must be the character of the perfect spiritual action. And so he goes on. Now you can see just in that which I have read rapidly, how equality is not only a foundation, but it is the base in which you are immersed in self. And therefore, in a sense, that is also the beginning of yoga. But if you notice in the description here, we are leading towards that by whatever process we have followed. As there is this sense of the self, which is felt more and more clearly, and one establishes in it, one becomes of its nature, of which equality is the most obvious. So, when we thus constantly create a gulf between ourselves and the things which we identified, with which we identified ourselves. So there is the constancy required. You cannot do this for 5 minutes in the morning and then later find yourself immersing into life. So you have 23 hours and 55 minutes of immersion in identification, of false identification, and 5 minutes of attempt to separate. Yes, it's good, over the years something will happen. But the key word, the active word here is constantly. When we thus constantly create a gulf between ourselves and the things with which we identified ourselves, their veils progressively fall away from us. It's as if all those things were veils over the self. And as they begin to fade, what remains is, and the self begins to be visible to our experience. Of that, then we say, now automatically, so far it was a negative effort. At this point, it turns into a positive effort. We turn towards that. Of that, then we say, I am that, the pure, the eternal, the self-blissful. And by concentrating our thought and being upon it, we become that and are able finally to renounce the individual existence and the cosmos. Now you see, even in this positive aspect of the practice, there is the concentration and the renunciation, and they go hand in hand. Each, remember, he described it as concentration is the right hand, renunciation the left hand, but the two are needed for the effective result. So we concentrate on the self, and in the process we renounce the individual existence and the cosmos, the universal existence also. And in the concentration on the self, we immerse. I am that, the pure, the eternal, the self-blissful. But this, remember, is the conventional path, and the practice of it is extremely helpful, but it is not complete. There will be something more to be done later. Now he offers you another variation to this practice. Another positive method, belonging rather to the Raja Yoga, is to concentrate on the thought of the Brahman and shut out from us all other ideas, so that this dynamo of mind shall cease to work upon our external or varied internal existence. By mental cessation, the vital and physical play also shall fall to rest in an eternal samadhi, some inexpressible, deepest trance of the being, in which we shall pass into the absolute existence. So in the Raja Yoga method, you will recall, there is the first basic preparation of purification through asana and pranayam, And then there is the pratyahara, the withdrawing of the attention from all things where it is spread out. There is the gathering and the holding, and from the holding there is a turning within and a dwelling upon the self, and then finally an immersion and self-loss in the self. But in this, you will see the focus is positive because you're drawing on the self. To some extent, there's a negation because you're also separating, withdrawing from the world, but nominally only to draw your attention inwards. But the thought of the Brahman and everything else cease to work on our external or varied internal existence. The mind stops in these. So there are two things the mind has to stop. First, the mind's obsession with thinking about things of the world. When you first shut that down, and it's easy to do, go into a room and close the door. Switch off the phone. If you like, switch off the light so you don't even see. If your room is sufficiently soundproofed, all your external things will stop for the mind. What happens then? The mind starts internal drama. It starts thinking, wandering, creating its own world. So then comes the next step, cessation of the varied internal existence. In fact, the varied internal existence is so interesting. When you shut out completely the external, not only the mind turns in its own internal subjective world of thoughts, but after a while, it begins even to drift into subtle worlds. It's very interesting experiment which is done in what is called an isolation tank. It started with some early experimenters in the 50s who had perhaps taken some drugs and they were thinking, oh, this is all experiences produced by the brain. So what if you shut out all inputs to the brain? What will happen? Will the brain go mad, or will it suddenly break out into these psychedelic realities? So they created what was called an isolation tank, completely soundproofed. You lie down into this small coffin-like thing, filled with water, salt water of the density of the body. So your body is floating, it touches nothing except the water, which is equally all around the body, of body temperature. So very quickly you find your body floating with a no contact anywhere on the skin, or equal contact everywhere, which effectively becomes no contact. No sensation of the body. And then soundproofed, complete isolation, black. Eyes open or closed makes no difference for you. And then all the interesting things begin to happen. For some people, nothing wonderful happens. They just feel relaxed, cool. They drift off into some kind of daydream or sleep. For others, it's as if something opens and they have experiences of subtle realities or worlds. Basically, when the mind is freed, it opens up to all these things. And so this also needs to stop. So he speaks of both. Concentrate on the thought of the Brahman and shut out from us all other ideas, so that this dynamo of mind shall cease to work upon our external or varied internal existence. So even that has to stop. If in the isolation chamber, you consciously even subside these internal activities, it can be a very interesting experience of drifting into some deeper reality of some relation with the self or Brahman. But it's only people for whom this is already a habit, or in whom the past imprint of this practice is there, that spontaneously tend to drift into such experiences. That's why those things don't have consistent results with everybody. It all depends on your readiness. But what happens here? We are focusing on the mind's dynamo coming to rest. And as a result, by mental cessation, the vital and physical play also shall fall to rest. And that follows because we are primarily mental beings. When the mind withdraws, the vital and the physical have no energy, no drive, and they begin to subside and become quiet on their own. Especially if the mind withdraws from the body consciousness, the body automatically goes into a kind of a relaxed stillness. And then from there, in an eternal samadhi, some inexpressible deepest trance of the being, in which we shall pass into the absolute existence. And so this would fulfill the object of the conventional yoga of knowledge. Sri Aurobindo now shows us, while this is valuable, what are its limitations? And then what's the correction we must bring in? This discipline is evidently a self-centered and exclusive inner movement, which gets rid of the world by denying it in thought and shutting the eyes of the soul to it in vision. But the universe is there as a truth in God, even though the individual soul may have shut its eyes to it. And the self is there in the universe really and not falsely, supporting all that we have rejected, truly immanent in all things, really embracing the individual in the universal, as well as embracing the universe in that which exceeds and transcends it. What shall we do with this eternal self in this persistent universe, which we see encompassing us every time we come out of the trance of inner meditation? So this is a very important problem. In your inner meditation, you say, all that is gone. You come out, it's still there. So now there are two options what we can do. The ascetic path chooses an option, and Sri Aurobindo shows even that has a limitation. And what's the complete path? But before that, in the wording here, there are very important suggestions which are also central to the larger goal of the integral yoga. He says this discipline is evidently a self-centered and exclusive inner movement. So what's wrong with that? In the ascetic path, either the world is a domain of suffering, which we have to get free from, or it is the domain of the devil that we have to escape from to go to the heavens of God, or it is a domain of illusion from which we have to get free in order to know the reality beyond. And so, a self-centered withdrawal is the right thing to do. Because others in any way are an illusion in that sense, equally as I am an illusion. It doesn't really matter. But still, something inside us rankles. Something is wrong. In fact, in the highest experience, even in the Buddhist path, where the world is, where you withdraw from the world of suffering into the absolute, on the brink of immersion in the absolute, the Buddha turns around and looks at the world with compassion and chooses to pause there and not withdraw. Chooses to pause and wait until the whole of creation is liberated. But similar idea you will find in various other traditions. In many mystical and occult traditions, the last test that is given to you, you have gone up a very narrow, risky path, precarious all the way through, and you've reached a highest point. And at that point, finally the goal appears before you. And in that moment, the test is given. Somebody else is seen, struggling and failing. You have a choice. If you engage with this somebody else to help, you will lose the goal. And at that point, one makes a supreme sacrifice to give up. To give up all that we have worked for to help another. At that point, the last step is completed. When one chooses to make that last step in isolation, it is, in a sense, Sri Aurobindo says, the height of egoism, that you let all else remain in suffering, in ignorance, and accept an exclusive liberation. But it is only when we accept to help others that our true sense of the liberation is fulfilled. And so there's a very subtle and a very difficult test which is put at the last step of the journey. In many of the old traditions, which had a narrow and precarious path of practice, very difficult, often it meant that you're willing to abandon the struggle of decades of work for someone else who is slipping and probably is not worthy. And this is the strange character even in the ascetic path. In the final step, you have, even the asceticism has to be abandoned. And that's the story we see also in the Mahabharata, when the 5 Pandavas make their last ascent. And the journey is, of course, described as a physical journey, but it is equally a symbolic journey. They climb up the Himalayas, and one by one, each of the brothers falls on the wayside, unable to complete the journey. Only Dhritarashtra, is it? So, I'm sorry, what was Dharmaraj, Yudhishthira, reaches the top, accompanied by a dog. And at the last step, he has to cross over. He refuses unless the dog also is allowed. Then, of course, the dog reveals himself and so on. But there is this very interesting contradiction of the very path of asceticism, which is inherent in the path itself, but at the final step. So this idea of self-centered liberation is something which Sri Aurobindo repeatedly points to as the flaw in the conventional ascetic approach to liberation. In the integral yoga, since the goal is not a withdrawal into some beyond, this does not become a serious issue in that way. It still can become a serious issue when, in the stages of the practice, one gets so obsessed with our own practice, with our own personal subjective realization, experiences and realizations, that we lose sight of God in the world, God in humanity, God in society, and so on. So Sri Aurobindo has an aphorism in his Thoughts and Aphorisms, which goes something, I don't have it by heart, but something like this, that something about how men abandon humanity in search for God, but with whom are they in love then? Because God is equally in humanity. That idea he brings in. So this correction will come later on, where we will see God equally in the whole manifestation. But there is yet a need for some kind of a personal effort. It should not become self-centered, the correction for which we will see. Second distortion, exclusive inner movement. It excludes everything which is outside and takes only what is inside and makes that the only passage to reality or the only reality. And in that exclusion gets rid of the world by denying it in thought. So first step is in the mind, which says all that is not I, not real or illusion or whatever form one may choose to take, and shutting the eyes of the soul to it in vision. And this is more serious. The mind can make an exclusion, but the soul also says, this is not my domain. This is not my domain of reality, of my world, of my action. I have to get to that transcendent, eternal, and so on. So the eyes of the soul also are shut in vision. And you see here something, again, you realize there's a flaw. There's a basic flaw to the whole approach. And that flaw hits us in the face when we come back from the experience. But the universe is there as a truth in God. This is such a powerful statement. The truth of the universe is in God. Where is the universe existing? It is not God puts out from himself into some otherness of self. There is only the divine. So the universe is born in the divine. It bursts out in the divine. It is held in the divine. It is formed out of the divine. And in essence remains always divine. And so the universe is there as a truth in God. And to deny that would be an error, isn't it? Even though the individual soul may have shut its eyes to it. And equally on the other side, the self is there in the universe, really and not falsely. Again, if we look at it, the universe is formed of the divine consciousness, and therefore the divine consciousness is present in all things. Nothing could exist if it was not supported by and formed of the divine consciousness. And so the self is there in the universe really and not falsely, supporting all that we have rejected, truly immanent in all things, really embracing the individual. And so to have to say that all this is not of my interest in my quest for God, suddenly it sounds so strange, so contradictory. Or we say simply, all right, I want to know God in his exclusion, in his absolute, in his transcendence only, and not in his totality. We may choose to say that, but why would we want to do that? We would want to know God in his totality. At least that would not be the path of the integral yoga to say that. We want to know God integrally as he knows himself. And this is included. So the self is there in the universe really and not falsely, supporting all that we have rejected. Truly immanent in all things. This word immanent, if you go to the etymology of it, it comes from in manere. In being inside, manere is to live in, living inside. The word manor comes from the same root, like living in the house. So immanent means to live inside. And what does one do when one lives inside? One enjoys. One chooses to enter in order to enjoy and to possess. This is what Sri Aurobindo says in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. All this is for the habitation of the Lord, is the first verse of the Isha. And Sri Aurobindo says the purpose of habitation is to possess and to enjoy. And the divine is possessing and enjoying the world in immanence. And not only in immanence inside everything, but really embracing the individual in the universal, as well as the universal, as the universe in that which exceeds and transcends it. So there are two embracements. He's embracing us as we move around in the universe. So if you look at it this way, the whole universe being formed of and filled with his presence, everything we do, we are not only supported from below, not only helped from above, surrounded and embraced by his consciousness, even as he is immanent within. And so there's an embracement from around and from within in the universe. But equally the universe itself, remember, is expressed from and held in something transcendent. And the transcendent embraces the universe, even as it stands above it in transcendence. So the immanence and transcendence are the two opposite. There is an immanence and there's a transcendence, and both stations are simultaneous. And in both there is an embracement. What shall we do with this eternal self in this persistent universe which we see encompassing us every time we come out of the trance of inner meditation? It is still encompassing us. I have shared with you the experience of Swami Vedabharati, which he narrated once. He is disciple of Swami Rama. He passed away only last year. He shared with us once how, when he was in deep meditation under help of his teacher, he was immersed in that, and then he came out of it, came out of something which was spaceless, timeless, or eternal, infinite, came out, and the shock of the universe around, and he said, what is all this? It was a shock, a surprise. What is all this? Everything is forgotten when you're immersed in that. And when you come back, suddenly it is unfamiliar. It is as if rediscovered, as if you're born anew in something which was non-existent to you. But it is there, exactly as it was when you left it. Because it is held by the divine. It has its own objective divinity supporting, immanent and embracing. Therefore, it sticks on. So what do you do with this? The ascetic path of knowledge has its solution and its discipline for the soul that looks out on the universe. And the passage of the ascetic is now described. But then Sri Aurobindo will give us our proper solution for the integral yoga, which we will have to continue afterwards. But we can briefly look at what is this ascetic solution. The ascetic path of knowledge has its solution and its discipline for the soul that looks out on the universe. It is to regard the immanent and all-encompassing and all-constituting self in the image of the ether, in which all forms are, which is in all forms, and of which all forms are made. In that ether, cosmic life and mind move as the breath of things, an atmospheric sea in the ethereal, and constitute from it all these forms. And what they constitute are merely name and form and not realities. The form of the pot we see is a form of earth only and goes back into the earth. Earth, a form resolvable into the cosmic life, and cosmic life, a movement that falls to rest in that silent, immutable ether. Concentrating on this knowledge, rejecting all phenomenon and appearance, we come to see the whole as an illusion of name and form in the ether that is Brahman. It becomes unreal to us. And the universe becoming unreal, the immanence becomes unreal. Okay, so far you saw the immanence, but that has become unreal. And there is only the self upon which our mind has falsely imposed the name and form of the universe. Thus are we justified in the withdrawal of the individual self into the absolute. So the method is very simple. You're starting with this idea that Brahman is ethereal, meaning, and it's a very important use of this vocabulary. Remember, the 5 elements in the traditions are the means by which form emerges out of that which is formless, timeless, spaceless. The first base of the consciousness is an expansion, which is what we call the ether. Within that, there are vibrations. And those vibrations entering in contact with each other become the air principle, creating through contact friction and heat, which becomes the fire principle, which in the rhythmic repetition of its concentration of tapas becomes the creator of form, and then the fluid flow of forms, the water principle, and then a gluing effect which stabilizes the form to create earth principle, and then you have this appearance of the world. The objective, divided appearance of things out of something which is not thing, which is essential, pure, formless, spaceless, timeless consciousness, is done by a 5-step process. Now, this is knowledge we need not go further in, but the first step of that is the ether, which is the closest we can conceive of as form of Brahman. So we conceive of Brahman as ethereal, in which mind and life as cosmic movements, universal, are like an air flowing inside the ether. They are secondary modifications of that which is silent and still supporting behind. And then, when you concentrate on this, you see only name and form of the flows of mind and life. Matter and the particular form resolves into universality of matter. Matter itself resolves into movement of energy of life. Life itself resolves itself into mind, which conceives the forms of life. And mind itself is a movement coming back to rest in the ethereal. And all of this is an appearance becoming illusory, settling finally in the ether of Brahman. Everything else is unreal. Our mind cast this unreality upon the Brahman. Our mind was in error. Now you see how this summarizes in sum the whole philosophy and therefore the practice of so many ascetic paths. And then Sri Aurobindo himself questions this. Still, the self goes on with its imperishable aspect of immanence, its immutable aspect of divine envelopment, its endless trick of becoming each thing and all things. We have called it a trick, but it is still continuing, or even if we call it a trick. Our detection of the cheat and our withdrawal does not seem to affect one tittle either the self or the universe. Must we not then know also what it is that thus persists superior to our acceptance and rejection, and too great, too eternal to be affected by it? So there's something persisting even after we have abandoned it. And it is superior to our rejection, superior to our calling it a cheat and a deception. Here too, there must be some invincible reality at work. And the integrality of knowledge demands that we shall see it and realize it. So there's some invincible reality. Whatever you may do to escape it, it persists, it continues. Even after the highest experience of dissolution, the world still continues. You have dissolved yourself, and in your experience, the world was gone, but it still continues. So something is important here. In the integrality of knowledge, we have to see that and realize it. Otherwise, it may prove that our own knowledge and not the Lord in the universe was the cheat and the illusion. This is the conclusion we will come to. That it was our knowledge which was deficient. We made the mistake. Therefore, we must concentrate again. Now you see what he has done. He has not discarded the ascetic experiences or the realizations. They are important. And the experience of becoming free from all this is a necessary experience. But it does not stop with that. From that station of freedom, you must concentrate again. And this time on what? Therefore, we must concentrate again and see and realize also this which persists so sovereignly, and must know the self as no other than the supreme soul, which is the Lord of nature, the upholder of cosmic existence, by whose sanction it proceeds, whose will compels its multitudinous actions and determines its perpetual cycles. And we will see the Lord, the Supreme, as the Lord of nature, who presides over these rhythms and sanctions them. But that's not all. And we must yet concentrate once again. So there are 2 degrees of concentration further to be made. After this is seen, and we must concentrate once again and see and realize and must know the self as the one existence who is both the soul of all and the nature of all. At once Purusha and Prakriti. And so able both to express himself in all these forms of things and to be all these formations. So this is the complete realization where we see the divine not only as soul inside the forms, but we see the divine himself taking on these forms and being both in a dual play. 2 stations, 2 poises of his own consciousness, Purusha and Prakriti, soul and nature. Otherwise, we have excluded what the self does not exclude and made a willful choice in our knowledge. If we don't do this, then we have chosen to exclude what self has not excluded, and we have chosen to make a specialized knowledge of our focus, abandoning the totality. In fact, he says, I skip a paragraph. The next paragraph ends by saying, for we demand knowledge that it shall unite. The knowledge that divides must always be a partial knowing, good for certain practical purposes. The knowledge that unites is the knowledge. It's a very important idea. Whenever you say, I know something, and the knowledge leads to a division, the distinction in the division is useful for practical purposes, but the knowledge itself is incomplete. There is a higher, more complete knowledge in which you will see the unity. That is what you must gain. The distinction may not be lost in that. The distinction is useful for the practical application. In order to gain that distinction, we play with the inferior knowledge and specialize in it, which is a divisive knowledge. But the true knowledge is the uniting knowledge. And in the uniting knowledge, distinctions are not lost, but they are held in a completeness. So this is the direction in which the whole discussion is moving. He describes how in the old system of looking at the Brahman in relation to the universe, they made 4 degrees of Brahman. But in our view, we must see it all as one continuous movement. And that is when we will know the totality in continuum of the one divine consciousness. So this will be we will review this. A very important vocabulary here, self, Lord, and Brahman. These 3 he has used repeatedly in a certain way. We had not so far touched upon it. We will explore these distinctions. If we had done the distinctions too soon, we would be lost in those differences. But right now we've got the big picture. We will review this text with those finer distinctions and understand more deeply why those distinctions are important. Because they are experiential distinctions, therefore we give them separate names. But finally there is one truth, and we must see how these experiential distinctions are united in a single, whole, indivisible experience, which is what we are aiming at as the goal of the yoga of knowledge. So we can pause here. It's a fascinating text, at the same time very practical, also philosophically deep, metaphysically rich, and experientially complete. It touches upon all facets of the experience. Nothing is left out.
The experience of my life experience, this difficult thing is not to get hooked on differences, but to have that synthesis.
Yes.
It's not easy.
Yes.
It really escapes.
Mm-hmm.
And if
Yes.
you know it's there, still you can't get to it.
Mm-hmm.
You are bound in those differences in endless discussions and agreements. You cannot come together. Although everybody knows there is
Right.
frustrating.
Right.
I don't know how to look through there and say, this is the higher truth,
Yes.
which is uniting these utterance.
Hmm.
It seems impossible where we are right
Yes.
now.
Yes. It is unfortunately one of the great difficulties in the ashram and in Auroville, because the mother and Sri Aurobindo have insisted so often on this, that there is always a higher synthesis. Whenever you have two differences, they are both false. And there is a higher synthesis above, in which we have to come and unite these two. We know this. So when we sit in discussion, we all know this. And yet we are somehow not able to do it. And it's the question, I've summarized the question already, that we know this, but we can't put it into practice. So what is it that we have to do? Why is it we are not able to put into practice something so obvious, as an idea so simple, so true we feel also, and yet we are not able to translate into action? And there are two difficulties here. One is the part which understands is different from the part which has the problem. So in my higher part of the mind, I understand, yes, there is a synthesis. In the lower part of the mind, which is tied to the senses, desires, and impulsions, likes, dislikes, egoistic needs and demands, and fears, insecurities, this is not felt or known. You see, because they're two different parts. When you, a child is asked to touch a lizard, you know it is safe, you know there is no danger, and yet your body goes, yuck, yuck, yuck. And there are some people who are able to assert that knowing onto the body and force themselves to touch a little bit and get back. Oh, it was not so bad. Now the body knows it was not so bad. Now I can reach out and try a second time. And yes, it's not really bad, and my whole body relaxes. And now the body has the experience, and I can touch the lizard or the snake or whatever it is. You see the difference. This part knew, this part had the fear. Until the part which has the fear experiences what it's like, nothing changes. It lives in its reaction. And the experience is either compelled upon it by forcing it, or the mind imprints its conviction on those parts and helps them to find their experiential correction. And this is really the problem. Unless we make the effort, it doesn't happen. And most people don't bother to make the effort. And in practice, therefore, the experience is compelled upon us after spending 2 years in talking and fighting, or longer. When finally the change is compelled on us by crushing circumstances, we realize, you know what, this is what we should have done right at the beginning. We don't know why we waited so long, why we were fighting for so long. And at that point, the experience hits. And by repeated series of such experiences, something of our egoistic insecurities finally accept, oh yeah, I know it's not worth it. Let me flow along. So if I wanted to not wait for crashing circumstances to push things, what do you do? And Mother offers a very practical resolution for this problem. We're sitting across the table, we have to do something, some common work, some objective, some ideal, some outcome that we're working towards. And she says, she gave many guidelines. So the first thing she said was, before you enter into any discussion or planning, each one makes effort to center themselves, so that what they speak, think, or act comes from some deeper or higher part, not our superficial, insecure, and egoistic center. So that effort of centering ourselves and shifting levels must be made ideally. Generally, if you make that effort, already the whole problem becomes much simpler. Second, if after this round of discussion, we find that it does not work, then she gave a second step. You take a break. You set aside. Each one concentrates, centers themselves, and come back. And at that point, she says, each one must be willing to give up some part of their personal preference in order for the central objective to be realized. Now, generally, if you just break and come back, already the tension and the habit of the engagement has lessened. You relax and you come back different, and things may flow. People may just give in spontaneously. Where they do not, then this practical, conscious effort of giving up some part, and it can be a tiny part of my personal preference. And when each one does that, somehow things coalesce around the center, which we all in a way agree with. So she says, in order to fulfill that central ideal, each one must give up some part of their personal preference. And this exercise, if it still fails, one can do it another time. Generally, by that time, always we find a solution. But in all of this, you see, there has to be an internal effort, ideally by each one. It's not enough that I make the effort alone and the other does not. And so that becomes for me the excuse. I make the effort every time, you do not, and therefore I will stop making the effort. So finally, it boils down to the consciousness of the people involved. Are we really committed to this purpose, to this goal, to this thing? And even to doing it in a superior way from a different consciousness. And finally, it is not the system, but the consciousness of our priorities and values, aspiration, highest goal, which will determine whether we are able to come together. In practice, in these kinds of challenging circumstances, the crisis forces us to realign with why we are here. When after 3 years of hammering and banging against each other, we fall back in exhaustion, you say, this is really not worth it. Why am I here? And we go back to fundamentals. And if everyone did that, actually, we would come back together and the problem would be solved. But generally, it happens with a few at some time and with a few later, and so on. But there's a very practical approach. If she's written it out, you can actually see the text. We place it, share it with the whole group, and we agree to follow this method. I think a lot could be done consciously. In group dynamics, often what happens also, especially in a sacred space like this, because we are a representative humanity, the problems in humanity seek their representation here. So there are forces. Knots, problems, tensions, conflicts are forces finally. And they're universal forces. And so when a situation is being taken up, let's say we have 5 people together, automatically the difficulty comes into us as a force pushing us. And this, which seems to be a very simple problem, suddenly acquires a gigantic character. And what would be otherwise a simple relation between us becomes now this huge complex situation. It was not so in the beginning. When we started the project, it went very smoothly. As we began to make good progress, suddenly the problems creep in and now want to be felt and assert themselves. And this is the reason why often we are told, when you're doing good work, don't speak about it, don't publicize it. The moment you publicize it, there are all these energies which now want to get in and either spoil the work or want their representation of their problem and so on. And suddenly what was moving smoothly hits a huge roadblock, and it's between us. And the interesting thing is, you knock out one person, the problem pops up through somebody else. It's as if on some level you cannot avoid the problem because it needs to be dealt with. It wants to be dealt with. But if at that point we recognize that this is the nature of the work here, and we make that effort to rise above and overcome ourselves, each one, we are participating in an overcoming for the world. The problem is being as if resolved for the world. And through us, it's as if in the world there's a release of that knot because we overcame it. So it's a great opportunity. On the one hand, it's a huge roadblock, something moving smoothly hits a roadblock. But if we recognize what it means and make the effort, we grow, and it's our contribution to the world, and the world also with us benefits. And we can take it in that spirit and so make that extra effort that is now suddenly required. And again, these are things which perhaps we have read 10 years ago, but it's good to remind ourselves now because this part does not know as the mind knows.
Can you elaborate something more on this being the seer and the seen? And this is catching yourself and still be doing the actions.
Yes. So in the first place, the question is can you elaborate on the seer and the seen, observing while in action? In the first place, when you start by saying, I am not body, who is saying that? It's generally your mind. Your mind stands back from the body. Similarly, in separating from emotions, it's your mind which stands back from the emotions. After that, you have to stand back from your mind. And that becomes suddenly a problem. But as we saw, the mind can stand back from its own processes, from its own habitual activities and tendencies. And so it's as if a part of the mind consciousness which stands back and observes. This station we call Manomaya Purusha, that is the witness in the mind consciousness. It is not the self by itself. But when we are able to bring ourselves to this station, at that point, in that freedom, this consciousness, because it is still, because it is pure witness, and is therefore of the nature of the self, of the true self, it enters in resonance, in affinity, and therefore can begin to feel or can open to the influence of the self. In fact, the way Sri Aurobindo defines this station of the Manomaya Purusha, the true witness in the mind, he says it is a reflection of the self in the mind. So if you look at it this way, ultimately there is only the self. The self modulating itself to manifest in these various gradations of consciousness is still supporting all these, isn't it? So the part of the self that supports the mind consciousness, there's a meeting point. In the mind consciousness, a part which leans back on the self, or a part of the self which leans to support mind, that point of contact is the Manomaya Purusha, the witness in the mind. In other words, it's the link point between the mind and the self. Similarly, on all levels, there is an equivalent. There is a Pranamaya Purusha, there is a witness consciousness in the life energies. Difficult to access because it is not of the same nature of our mental awareness, but one can, in the life energies, experience a kind of a standing back of the nature of life, stillness, supporting the life activity. And when you rest in that, you can experience self through that. Similarly, even in the physical body, there is a poise of body consciousness which supports activity and form and impulse of body. It is of the grade of body consciousness, but is not in the active domain of the form and movement. It is a stillness in the body consciousness which you can feel, and it is from there that the body consciousness opens to self and can receive the impact of self in the body. So in the sadhana, eventually one would develop this station on all three levels. And as you experience the invasion of the self, the silence, the peace, the power of the self into the mind, similarly into the life energies and even in the body consciousness, one can receive those impacts. Experiencing it on one level makes it easier to experience on other levels. But eventually all three must experience the support of the self. Then your body itself, as body consciousness, feels self. And that's when the body can begin to consciously aspire for the divine, and the possibilities of the transformation of the body consciousness can begin. And these are all within our reach as we are. These are experiences well within our capacity to have, even if initially in a brief way.
What is the role of the psychic being or the soul? That is,
Mhm.
what is the mind?
Yes.
It is dividing itself.
Yes.
What is the still mind and what is the active mind?
Hmm.
So what is the role of the psychic being?
Yes, so this is an important point. Where is the psychic being in all this? What is the station of the psychic doing throughout? As it is right now, I, the mental person, am not conscious of my psychic being. It may be conscious of me or it may be half asleep, depends. If it is conscious of me, its influence is what makes in my mind the aspiration to make this effort. Its influence filling my heart is what awakens in my heart the love for the divine, isn't it? So I am receiving its constant help and support in my overall journey, but through so many layers of influence. If I were to completely ignore it, it would be possible for the mind to open to the self directly and for the self to invade the mind's awareness and for the mind to immerse itself in the self. You don't need the psychic. Such is often the path that certain ascetic practices take because their goal is to withdraw and immerse. The psychic being is irrelevant. But since our goal is to manifest, the center of the personality through which the manifestation has to take place is the psychic being, the true person. And so even if mind opens to self, eventually at some point our effort is to open the mind itself to the influence of the psychic being. If this has been done sooner, Sri Aurobindo says it is safer, and one can enter in relation with the self through the experience of the psychic being, and the experience has a different character. If you enter the self without that, it's easy to slip into this world is illusion experience. If you enter into the experience of the psychic being to whatever degree and then open to the self, then yes, the world is my playfield. The self is my foundation. And the psychic being knows the world as a reality of its experience in which the divine has to be manifested. So you do not have this dichotomy, this separation, the illusoriness of the world, and so on. So that is why in this yoga, Sri Aurobindo recommends the awakening of the psychic influence as early as possible. And then it leads this experience itself of the mind entering in relation with the self.
Can it be at certain stage, in this higher state, can be your inner guide, your inner towards the transition?
What is inner guide?
Inner guide means when you have this state of still mind and that
Okay.
you said you see the psychic being sometimes does not play slow, but it is there. But can it lead you forward?
Yes. So you have used this word inner guide. I want to actually widen the discussion. You will find in a lot of the New Age literature these phrases: finding your inner guide, finding your higher angel guide, and spirit guide, and things like that. These are often very dangerous ideas, and anything could masquerade in the form of offering guidance, and you wouldn't know the difference. So the only true guide is the divine consciousness, the divine presence, and its influence felt in you, its guidance felt in you, is known truly only if the psychic discrimination is awake. Even if its guidance comes in the mind, if you don't have the inner discrimination, you might get deceived. You might mistake something else, some suggestion. So people say, I went to the samadhi, I bowed down, I asked this question, and a voice spoke. And so I followed. But Mother says, be careful of voices, because in the samadhi you're most open. Any voice can masquerade and give you whatever you want to hear, or even give you wrong advice. Just because you're near the samadhi does not mean you're protected from a false suggestion. So always it will be the inner discrimination which will come from the psychic, which will be the safest reference. But in the absence of that actively felt, you use your rational mind. In the mind itself, you can develop a kind of a familiarity for that vibration of feels right or does not feel right. Something feels dramatic, something feels exaggerated, something is not okay. I hold provisionally judgment. I will not accept blindly. So one can start with this kind of an exercise. But what we would mean ultimately by the inner guidance will be always the divine presence felt within us. And it will be that which will be our reference. But one must still make effort to learn to feel that and know its guidance in its purity. Otherwise, your own desires can easily imitate divine guidance. I felt strongly that I should do this. I felt deeply that I should do this. Even emotions can be deep and very deep. So just because it's deep, it's not necessarily true. So there's a quality of vibe which one gets familiar with over time. And that's why it is so useful in a space like this, where the vibration of the psychic influence is very strong, near the samadhi. But if one makes the effort to cultivate the feel of that, it's easy to do it here. And if through the devotion, the bhakti, the love for the Divine Mother, through offering oneself to the divine, the influence of the psychic presence comes forward strongly enough, then one begins to distinguish it very clearly. And the mixtures can be sifted.
Can it be done with the grace at that time?
The grace is always there to help. But still, it is possible for us to deceive ourselves, even when the grace is trying to help. That's why the initial preparation is so important. That's why initially so much importance is given to the love for the divine, the devotion, and the self-consecration, self-surrender, and so on. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Whenever they used to pray to Shiva, he used to appear on the side of the
Yes.
in Sri Krishna, when he used to appear before the bhakta and then takes his responsibility and all that. But now it has become so
So the question is, although the divine is immanent, why is it so difficult to realize the divine? And she says, in the old days, it was so easy. You could pray to Shiva and he appeared before you and gave you a boon. Nowadays, it's become very difficult. Let me tell you an interesting story. This is somebody practicing yogi, living in New York, who told me of a story of somebody he knows living in Chennai. This man is very deep in his sadhana, a more ascetic type of sadhana. At some point in his youth, this young man was craving darshan, revelation of the Lord. He was a Shiva Bhakta. And it became so intense that he was suffocating. He was as if he felt that his life would end if he did not have the darshan. And at some point in his whole being was burning in agony. He took a knife and said, I'll cut off my head if you don't appear before me. And at that point he had the darshan. Yes, Ramakrishna Paramahansa also. You try it, if you take a sword and say, I'm going to cut off my head, you might just end up harming yourself. It won't work. It was the intensity of the call. The point where he was willing to abandon everything, including himself, in order to realize the divine. That's when the point of contact is made. If you see the principle behind it, you do not need to resolve to such extreme dramatic means. If in a very quiet, gathered concentration, you enter in that exclusive concentration where all else is let go, including yourself, you forget yourself. The moment when you forget yourself is when you will make the contact with the divine presence.
Is it the condition of the divine? Is it that?
It's not the condition that the divine puts as a tyrant. It's the condition in which we become capable of knowing the divine, because that's the point where we let go of the things which screen us from the divine. So look at it this way: the divine has not made it difficult. Coming back to your question, although divine is immanent, why is it so difficult? It's not that the divine has made it difficult out of some perverse pleasure. It's the nature of the way the universe is formed, that there are layers and layers and layers and layers. And where we are is across so many layers, so many veils. And therefore, the divine is aware of us, but we are unable to be aware of him because of the layers in which we are concealed. And so an effort is to be made to remove the layers. Now again, the divine can intervene and remove the layers, but if he did right now, you would be so overwhelmed, you might lose your individuality. And the purpose for which you took individuality would be lost. And therefore, in the evolution, there is a gradual step-by-step awakening and gradual thinning of layers across millions of years and lives. You now have got to the point where, across those millions of lives, where you say, now this is extremely important for me. I can't wait another million years or lives. I need it in this lifetime. And so you have now concentrated yourself to speed up the process, which so far nature was pushing you unknowingly. You have now taken charge and have begun the process. You have just begun it. Okay, a few lives ago we started, or whatever, it doesn't matter. And now we're just picking up momentum. We're just developing the capacity. And so it's understandable that there's still an effort to be made. But on the other side, the divine is also making an effort to help you at each step, not too premature. If right now suddenly the veils are removed, you'd just lapse into inertia, Brahman, lost in Brahman. And then veils put back, you'll wake up, you'll have tears streaming from your eyes. I don't know what happened, I was knocked out. It changes you nothing. World doesn't change, you don't change. So we want a gradual process, and yet the gradual has to be accelerated, so that I, as a conscious individual, may know the all and yet be held in a focal point for the all to manifest. That being the case, there is a difficulty. You see the point? It's not made difficult for the purpose of making difficult. It's made difficult because of the way the reality, the manifestation is, and the way we chose to enter body consciousness through which to realize the divine. We could have chosen not to enter, and we could have chosen to stay in the Satchidananda, there would be no problem. We chose to enter into the domain of the veils, and then from there to cut through the veils and realize and manifest the divine, which in a way for the soul is an adventure. It's an experience of learning, of growth, of discovery, of self-discovery and God discovery, and of experiencing all possible colors of relationship with the divine. So from this perspective of the psychic being, it's a great adventure, a great journey of discovery and growth and experience. To the extent that we are aligned to that influence, we enjoy each step of the life in this way. We still want to speed it up, because now we are sufficiently awake that we realize this is why we came. Yes.
I would like to share something. When I remember when I was like 5, 6, 7 years old, and I'm from North India, so I used to just climb over the mountains in the morning. I would always love to get up early and look at the sunrise, and I will climb up, and the moment I will climb up, and I will wait for sunrise. So the moment the sun will rise, I will really feel it's the God, it's the
Yes,
God.
yes.
And I felt Lord as sun. But when I saw my parents playing in a, we had a small
Right.
temple, and when I saw my mother is lighting the diya and praying to Krishna and doing so many songs and all, in those things also I felt little bit presence of the divine. But I always used to ask myself that the Lord comes every day in the morning to us. The Lord comes, and why my parents are going there instead of coming out and praying to the sun?
Yes.
And for me, the God was there. I never had a doubt that the God is not there. But so when I saw the religious life, the beliefs and everything, I had so many questions that why those unnecessary things. But yes, then I came to Sri Aurobindo ashram, and then I felt a deep divine presence again, and I saw flowers, and for me the sun was the God and is the God, and the flowers are God in nature almost. And then once I read in Mother's writing that look at the sunrise, it is your Lord who comes to you, and everything was
Yes.
it's what he said.
Yes, I think everyone could hear. She was loud enough. But this experience in childhood of seeing the divine presence, the divine in the sun, or in flowers, or in other expressions in form, was spontaneous. You didn't have to do anything to experience that. It's because in childhood, we are much more open. The influence of the soul and its perception of the world is much more vivid, especially when the soul is more conscious, mature, or it has gone through a greater development in earlier lives, and it's spontaneous. Unfortunately, as the personality develops, the mind forms, the emotional being, and the body hardens, they form like coverings, and the experiences quickly recede. The age which you mentioned, 5, 6, 7, 8, those are the ages when one is still open, and generally around 12, when the mind kicks in and individuality becomes to assert, often these things close. And if you have not closed it, it's a great gift. But even for those who are closed, the fact that they had that experience is a sign that there is an opening, there is a readiness for a spiritual life. Whether they will take to a spiritual life or not is then left to the vagaries of circumstances, or if the soul is awake enough, at some point it will break through and assert and say, this I have to do now, and push the personality. But if the personality is formed without covering up the soul's sensitivity and spontaneous perception of the divine, then it's a great gift. Then the whole journey can be so much smoother and faster and beautiful at each step. Because at each step you are entering in relation with the divine in all these beautiful world experiences. One may not have that experience which she has described as we are today, but knowing that it's possible, one can cultivate it. You stand before the sun as it rises, and there's a period of a few minutes when suddenly there's a presence, and it's a mystic transition point. Hold that, feel the vividness of the presence there, and afterwards, when the sun moves, suddenly it becomes the normal light of day. But that moment, if you catch, and in this way, briefly, we touch different experiences in nature, and then perhaps even generally, we look at the world from a height, from the top of a building, even in the middle of the city. Sometimes that gives you distance enough that you can see in a dispassionate way and experience something, some presence. But one has to cultivate, and by cultivating, the thing can awaken quite quickly. And then we can work on it to maintain something of it throughout the day. So we have right now a very practical application, a practice Sri Aurobindo has given us. I am not body, I am not life, I am not mind. Standing back from the layers in the mind, and then to remain in awareness of the self, I am that, the pure, the eternal, the self, blissful. And something of this practice we can consciously work upon, and the rest of the further concentrations will naturally unfold, and we'll continue the study of this text next Friday. Oh.